I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
If anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
You went to Syria, but first, I'm trying to remember exactly how we met.
I believe it was over some internet-based banter about religion.
Yeah,
a few years ago now, you quite rightly educated me on quite a few things as well. A lot of misconceptions that people such as myself that perhaps don't have such a religious background didn't understand, and I greatly appreciated it, and our friendship sort of blossomed from there.
yeah. Just this one of these things in the internet Facebook comment section, and we sort of became friends from that in real life.
Yeah, which is a great thing, especially considering the distance between us as well.
Yeah, so it's been interesting to watch your adventures develop. So, what possessed you to go to Syria?
I think that's the most common question that I've been asked so far. In all honesty, I don't really know. I think my passion really is for traveling the sort of weird, the wonderful, the places that aren't necessarily trodden by the average traveller, and then relaying the information on how to do that. And Syria, I guess, just seemed like quite a logical choice, considering the circumstances. But the focus was more on showing people perhaps the truth of the place and how easily it could be travelled, how safe it actually was, and how to do that.
So how long have you been following the situation in Syria?
Since the beginning. Since about 2012. So I had initially planned to go out there when it was just a civil war, and it was the rebels that had the uprising. I was planning to go with a friend of mine who's a photographer. We're going to go out and try and cover the situation there. Flying into Jordan and crossing the border at night through the desert, and then being snuck in by the rebels into some tunnels they were using into Damascus to try and report on the situation. Unfortunately, the situation worsened quite quickly with infiltration of Al-Qaeda in the forms of Nusra, Jaish al-Islam, and then from that ISIS. So we decided it was potentially best to keep a distance at that point and wait until things calmed down enough that it became safe to travel again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's been this really unique situation in Syria that's kind of been the epicenter of sort of Sunni militancy, as far as I can tell. I mean, it was so bizarre for me because I started studying the Islamic world in probably 2012, and I was always kind of wondering, well, you've got this kind of idea of a caliphate that's in the past, and why are there not people currently trying to resurrect that idea? And then ISIS comes on the scene a couple of years after that. So it was this really fascinating thing to kind of discover this claim and then see people trying to live it out. Like they're just trying to. It's really like it was. If you read the Islamic history, and then ISIS is almost like this kind of Comic-Con version of what people are trying to do. They're trying to dress, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi kind of tries to dress up like he's Uthman or Omar, and everyone tries to look the part, and it's really bizarre to see it unfold on the pages of the news.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's a lot of conflicting arguments about this, and I think a lot of the influence from what I've seen has come from the Saudis, who are definitely up there, I think, with the more extreme forms of Islam in terms of the way they run their country with Sharia law and everything else that's involved. But they're still not quite to the extreme level that ISIS seem to come out as. And I think the big turning point was when, I mean, we're all aware of the atrocities that ISIS have committed. And I think when Al Qaeda come out and publicly stand against you as being a bit too far right, then I think that says a lot. Yeah, I just don't. I think, as you said, you know, they wanted the caliphate, they wanted this Islamic State, and it's just something that we've not seen before to this extremity with any country, no matter how severe the different type of Islam is that a country adopts. I forget what they classed as in Saudi. Is it Wahhabism? I don't know a lot about Islam, so you have to forgive me on my lack of knowledge there.
Yeah. So Wahhabism actually has its roots in Saudi Arabia. Although the thing to understand about Saudi Arabia is that you've got this very uneasy alliance between the government and the Wahhabis. So you kind of had this pact in around 100 years ago between the Saud family and Wahhabs, Ibn Wahhab, the guy who sort of sets it all up. And it's basically, you deal with religion, you deal with politics, and we'll leave each other alone. Really, you've got this ironclad political alliance from the 70s, but almost part of what's been going on is you look at ISIS happening, which is this kind of crazy form of Wahhabism in Syria and Iraq, which has turned the country into ruins. Yet at the same time, you see this Arabic merchant mentality prospering somewhere like Dubai, if you've ever been there.
I haven't yet, no. It is on the list.
Yeah, put it on the list. But so I think Saudi Arabia right now is trying to move towards a more Dubai type like model. So if you look at the current guy, Mohammed bin Salman, whatever you think, whether he's a good person or a bad person, not really my place to say. But if you look at the kind of ways he's moving the country, he's actually outlawed the religious police's powers of arrest. So before in Saudi Arabia, if you weren't conducting life in a proper Islamic way, these people could arrest you and they could send you to the police, you'd be put in jail. And basically, they now only have the powers to actually advise people. So you just have these guys in trucks going around being like, hey, your trousers should be longer.
Yeah, very similar to what we saw with ISIS, but, you know, as you said, with less power as such.
Yeah. So if you look at the way the leadership of Saudi Arabia is talking right now, Mohammed bin Salman said publicly, he said, Saudi Arabia is going to become what it once was, a moderate Muslim country where people of all religions are welcome. We're not going to waste 30 years dealing with extremists. We're going to destroy them today. So Saudi Arabia is not what it was even 10 years ago. There's been some crazy changes in the country, and there's all sorts of things that factor into that. But part of it is the country's desire to survive and thrive in the world once the oil runs out.
Okay, it seems like a pretty solid plan.
Yeah, it's risky, but it's solid. Speaking of risky, solid plans, so talk about like how difficult is it to get into Syria right now?
It requires some work, but it's doable. So you have to have a letter of invitation to get into the country initially. So you need that before you can go for the visa. So I contacted a travel company out there called Mithra Travel. Gave them some information, some details. They sorted out the letter of invitation for the country. I flew into Lebanon because you can't fly into Damascus Airport at the moment from any sort of Western countries. You can fly in from anywhere in sort of, the UAE, from Turkey, from Russia as well. But it was easier for me to fly into Beirut, into Lebanon. I was picked up by a driver there and was driven across the border that first night through the mountains and into Damascus. So easily doable. I think the drive from Beirut is about 2.5 hours, with obviously all the military checkpoints, and you stop for the visa. Visa's $140. Simple as that.
That's not bad. So I've been through several borders in my lifetime. Some of them are really easy. Some of them are hard work, like China's hard work.
Yeah.
And the US is up there, to be honest. Israel, you went to Israel, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Okay. We can cut that out in post production if you want.
No. That's absolutely fine. No, I'm quite open about it. Yeah, so I've been to Israel, been to Palestine, obviously same as you as well. And I took a lot of advice from you as well before I went. Such a big problem trying to travel anywhere else in the Middle East, having done that.
Yeah.
I did make sure before I removed everything from social media. Obviously, you don't get stamps in the passport; they give you the ID card. Where I messed up was I left the luggage sticker on the back of my passport. Didn't think anything of it. Went to check in. This was in the UK, and the woman behind the counter was looking at my passport. She goes, "Have you ever been to Israel?" I said, No, not at all. She went, "Okay. What's this sticker on the back of your passport?" I just couldn't believe it. I thought I'd done so much to prepare for this. I said, "I don't know." She just went, "Remove it." Yeah, cheers. Sorry. So I just scratched it off, and on the way out in Lebanon, I actually I had a run-in with the military there, but we'll move on to that. But I had to go back through passport twice, and I've just got a passport cover for Christmas off my brother. And bear in mind, I've been through well over 50 military checkpoints in both countries for this trip constantly. I've had run-ins with the secret police and all sorts of things. And it was the last guy to ever check my passport before I left, started shouting at me for having this passport cover. And I didn't understand. He said, "You shouldn't have this here." I said, "Why?" He went, "This stamp." And I went, I don't understand. He said, "It's an Israeli stamp." I went, "Yeah, but it's a passport cover. It's not the passport." He said, "I don't care. Get rid of it. Throw it in the bin." And that was the sort of hostility there towards Israel in both Lebanon and Syria. I went past a shop out there that they'd had the Israeli flag painted as almost like a doormat in the entrance to the shop, with people wiping their feet on it as they went in. So yes, it's something you've got to be really careful about if you do go out there, is whether or not to mention that.
Yeah, that's intense. I actually, with all that intensity, I was really surprised how laid back the Israeli airport was.
I found that on the way in. They questioned me for about 40 minutes on the way out.
Okay.
Yeah, and I lost my temper quite a bit with them at that point, because it was the worst form of questioning I think I've ever been through. All to do with me and my other half. How long have you known each other? Where do you live? How far apart? How often do you see each other? And it was just the same questions over and over that didn't really seem to gain much value to them. And I get the whole point is for the differing stories and see if there's anything else, but it just seemed to really not that it ruined the end of the trip for us, but it just certainly left a bit of a sour taste in our mouths when we were trying to leave. Whereas, as you said, on the way in, you pretty much just walked through.
See, my only experience on the way out is I was getting ready to put my luggage in the scanners, and I was about to take my shoes off. And there's this old Israeli guy behind me, and he says, "You do not have to take your shoes off. This is a civilized country."
I won't pass a comment on that.
Then he said, "The other countries, they're looking for the bomb. We're looking for the terrorists." So I guess you got profiled.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem I had out there is obviously I'm British. I've got a British passport. My family were immigrants from Ireland, and I didn't know this till I was out there. But the IRA were fighting with the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation, and they were actually training the Palestinians on how to make bombs. And I didn't realise with the tricolour on my arm, the Israelis weren't overly warm with me. However, when I crossed into Palestine, people were waving the flags at me and absolutely everything. I got the warmest welcome. I didn't realise that was why until my guide in Palestine explained. So maybe that was some of it.
That my strategy while I was there is I had a Israeli Air Force T-shirt that I bought, and then I had a Palestinian scarf. Right, so when I was in the Palestinian areas, I'd wear the scarf, And then when I was in the Israeli areas, I take it off, and I just subtly go by everywhere.
That's a brilliant idea. I think I certainly need to up my disguises a bit more. I think I was so prepared going into Lebanon and Syria this time. So when I travel, I'm the typical. If it's cold, I'm in North Face. If it's hot or it's going to be muddy, I'm wearing craghoppers. I wear Mendel boots, and I look like a cross between a third-rate journalist and a sort of part-time jungle explorer. And that's certainly not the look that you want to go for when you're trying to not look like either a journalist or a military-age male that could be collecting intel when you land on the ground. So I travelled in just jeans, t-shirt, and trainers this time. But I was in Aleppo, and I was wearing boots, green sort of craghopper trousers, and a fleece, and I had a chest camera on to try and get some footage at night round a market, and that was promptly followed by a visit from the Secret Service. So I tried to be careful after that.
I see that. So you've got this a lot of travel, a lot of military checkpoints. Tell me what it's like to kind of enter Syria right now. You're past the military. What's the country like once you get inside right now?
The thing that I found the weirdest about this was I've crossed. Obviously, I just recently came back from another trip in southern Africa. So I crossed South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, back to Botswana, back to South Africa, and the checkpoints there. I think some of those were more work to get through than they were in Syria. And I think the border crossing, when you actually come through, is relatively easy and relatively benign. Nobody's armed. There's no guns. This is the thing that I found incredibly strange. I didn't see a gun until I got to Damascus. The first time I saw one of the guys with a Kalashnikov. And I went through maybe 5 or 6 military checkpoints in Lebanon, through the border crossing, which is really militarized, but with no guns, through into Damascus, into Syria, through loads of checkpoints there, no guns. The first time I saw it was in Damascus, and that was the most surprising thing to me. So peaceful, that crossing. A lot of snow coming through the mountains. I think, if anything, the scariest thing for that initial journey was probably the other drivers, which, if you've ever been to the Middle East, is it's always a concern. It was so easy, so straightforward.
That's really strange. So you went to a few different places. So you went to Aleppo, Damascus.
Yeah, so I travelled into Damascus. I went from there up to a place called Malula, where there was a church that was destroyed by I can't remember whether it was ISIS or al-Nusra. A lot of nuns were kidnapped. I went there. The church has been rebuilt now, and it's amazing to see what they've done. I then travelled from there up to Homs, which was just heartbreaking, absolutely devastating to see that. We then went to a place called Hama, not very far apart. Homs, as you've seen in the media as well, and obviously the photos I've been posting, was flattened, absolutely devastated, bullet holes everywhere, shrapnel damage. I found mortars in the street. We went to Hama, completely untouched, and the reason being, so as soon as we arrived in Hama, I saw a lot of armed soldiers, but also I saw a lot of women in niqabs and full-face burqas, which I'd not seen. Now, Assad is Alawite, and visually you can't see the difference between those and the Christian population of Damascus, because they dress very modern. They don't wear face coverings, they wear makeup, t-shirt, jeans, all that sort of thing. This place, Hama, the first place I went to, where I actually saw the more extreme forms of Islam. And it just so happens that the north of the city is completely full of al-Nusra fighters, who are a branch of al-Qaeda. And they're pretty much left alone there at the moment, from what I can tell. But it's, I suppose there's no, there's no coincidence that that place was completely untouched. It's one of the most extreme parts of the country for extremist Islam and full of al-Nusra fighters, which was just really strange. And I didn't have the same warm feeling there that I had in the rest of the country. It was still nice. There was no trouble, and I wasn't worried or panicked, but you could tell there was a very different feel and a different feel towards me. I noticed that.
Interesting. So how does that like function as part of Greater Syria right now? Does it have just sort of its kind of autonomy to do what it wants, or how does it?
No, sorry, carry on.
I don't really have a good question. I'm just curious about how they relate to the rest of the country.
It's a symbiotic relationship, I think. Although there were a lot of women there in niqabs, and there's still a Christian population there. Not as big, but there still are some Christians there. There are other forms of Islam as well. I think Syria, from what I've seen, seems to be the perfect example of exactly how Islam and Christianity in their various different forms can live side by side without any issue at all. Hama at the moment, I think, because there's no threat there, there's no terrorist attacks, there's no fighting, from what I can see. The government, I think, is sort of dealing with the more serious problems before they potentially move on to areas like this. You know, you don't stir at the hornet's nest while you're trying to fight fires in other places. But I was happy to leave. Should we say that?
Yeah.
So again, there was no animosity towards me at all. I didn't feel unsafe. I want to stress that a lot. But I wasn't welcomed with open arms like I was in the other cities.
Yeah, there's a kind of a tension there that's not everywhere else.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So what's Damascus like now? Because when everything started, there's a lot of chaos there. Do you get the sense that it's a city that's recently gone through a war, or does it feel different than that?
No, I mean, the actual destruction is only on the outskirts of the city. Now, the city itself is incredible. It really is. It's amazing. It's so westernized, very modern. There are, as I said, various different types of Islam, various different types of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestants, all living side by side. And, people walking hand in hand, people dressed as Westerners, people still wearing the traditional veil and the headscarves. When I was there, it was Christmas, so there were Christmas trees everywhere, so much more than I've seen in the UK or in Europe. Christmas decorations everywhere, people dressed as Santa, people in traditional headscarves taking selfies in front of Christmas trees, and it was such a warm atmosphere to it. It was so welcoming, so loving, so peaceful, and again, absolutely no feeling of tension there at all. Though I did go to the gym one day, and I walked back wearing shorts and t-shirt, not thinking about it, and that drew a lot of attention. not negative. You could just see people sort of looking, and I think a few photos were taken. But again, it was just it was all really nice, really nice.
So, how much chance did you get to interact with locals while you were there?
Quite a bit. I mean, I didn't have a minder like you potentially expect for some of these countries. I had a guide with me the whole time, a chap called Mukhlis Clef, he's been a tour guide for 36 years. He's a doctor in history, speaks fluent German, lived and was educated in Germany for a while as well. Great guy, brilliant sense of humour, and very, very honest and very open. When we were in Damascus, I had a lot of free time on my own. Same in Aleppo as well, and then the same when I went back to Damascus. So even when I was with him, rather than being shied away from people, I was sort of taken to people, taken into shops. We interacted, we sat and had tea and ate fresh bread and various other things. And then my free time as well, I went out for a drink. Obviously, I went to the gym, spoke to some people there, and I think everyone, apart from when I was in Hama, everyone was really, really happy to see me.
So how do you think what's the sort of general mood of the country right now? Would you say it's one that's cynical, hopeful? Where do you think people
Sad.
want the country to go? Sad?
Yeah, I think people are sad. I think they are hopeful that this war is going to end soon. I think people are. It's a difficult one. I think, yeah, people are they're hurt, they're sad. I think you'll struggle to find a household in Syria that has not been affected by this in some way. I mean, just to give you an example, so my guide Muklis, his son, 22 years old, was killed outside their apartment in Damascus. So his apartment was on the front line where al-Nusra had made it to the outskirts of Damascus. Everybody left his apartment block and he refused to go, which again is testament to the spirit of the Syrian people. And I didn't realize how close it was until I actually went to his for New Year's Eve, and I looked out, and 100 yards away there was an apartment block which was semi-destroyed, and that was where al-Nusra were. Now they'd been firing mortars and rockets because the army were obviously, near his apartment block as well. And his son was worried that a mortar may have damaged his car. So he goes outside to check on it, and as he goes outside, another mortar hits, kills him in front of his family. 22 years old, he was a DJ, not part of the military, not part of al-Nusra, they were a Catholic family, and just caught in the crossfire. I mean, my guide himself, the car we were travelling around in, had been shot 3 times by snipers and still had the holes in, one near the windscreen, one near the back, and one had gone through the parcel shell. And his was just one story amongst everyone else, and I think everyone feels the same. There's that tenacity and that fighting spirit to carry on, but at the same time that sadness that sits below the surface is just the loss and the destruction there.
So what do you think people's attitude towards Assad, the current regime, is in Syria right now?
Very different to the way the Western government portrays it, and that was something I was extremely shocked about. Before I went out, I potentially had some preconceived ideas about Bashar al-Assad and the regime and the way they treated the people and what they caused. And the people, from what I've seen, loved him. And this wasn't a sort of facade like you would expect to see in North Korea or a traditional, dictatorship at all. I think the people genuinely do adore Assad. And I think the fact that he comes from the background of the Alawite, who are maybe only 10% of the Muslims in Syria, if he didn't have the genuine majority, I think, of the people there, I don't think he would be in power. I think the way that Western media portrays him is very different from the reality on the ground. And I did try and have sort of quiet conversations with people about this, so they could speak freely, and everyone felt exactly the same. I think they're sick of the war. They feel the rebels who were there initially, they feel they're terrorists. I think they just want to see peace and prosperity in Syria, and I think the biggest issue they've got are the sanctions that have now been imposed by the UK, the US, and the EU, which are just strangling the country. So I think they feel not resentment, but I think fear of what's going to happen next.
I ran into the same thing. I had a Syrian stay with me last year, and he was just believed a lot of the media reports about Assad in the West were a conspiracy, and I'm not personally sure it's that simple, but
No.
I think that you've got this. I think generally most people in the Middle East have a very unideological view of politics. It's all pragmatics. That
Yeah.
you think, okay, not everything about him is great, but look at the alternatives. All right, so I think
you hit the nail on the head with that.
So if you think about Syria, so if you think about when Assad was peacefully in power, people have this idea of, okay, there's problems here, but look at the alternatives. And now people can look around the country and say, look at the alternatives, right? It's like,
yeah, very much so.
So it's this thing where, okay, well, revolution, yay. Did you have a plan for that?
Yeah, I think all you have to do is look at the destabilization of other areas of the Middle East. I mean, you look at Iraq. I mean, look at when they got rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and look at the vacuum that left and the troubles that's caused ever since, which has pretty much led to what happened in Syria as well. I think, yeah, I mean, and don't get me wrong, I never compare Assad to Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi at all. But I think it's certainly along the same lines. As like you said, the people there, potentially they want it changed. There was some political unrest, but yeah, I think now when you put things into perspective, they would give anything to go back 9 or 10 years and to just continue on the path they were on.
So that's kind of Damascus. You've got a modern living city.
Yeah.
You can kind of go out, you can do stuff, you can have normal activities. How does that compare to Aleppo?
It's quieter in Aleppo, but still an amazing place. I genuinely, I fell in love with Aleppo, and I fell in love with the people there. I think there was some damage towards the outskirts of the city. Again, from what I'd heard on the Western media, I wasn't expecting to see a single building intact out there. I just found that wasn't the case at all. There was nowhere near as much destruction as I'd seen in a lot of the other places. Now, the road to Aleppo was littered with tanks, some of the old Russian tanks that they've got out there, the pickup trucks from ISIS and al-Nusra that were just blown to pieces. They were Russian-made armored personnel carriers, which I think were potentially taken by ISIS or al-Nusra, and then petrol tankers, buses, things like that were used to ferry these troops around that had all been destroyed by airstrikes. So seeing all of this on the way in, and you sort of think, what am I walking into here? What's the level of destruction I'm going to see? Because Homs was leveled from the areas that I saw, and I didn't see anything really leading up to it. Now I'd seen, the whole sections of road being completely resurfaced. I'd seen, main battle tanks blown up with the turrets separate from the body of the vehicle. I'd seen pickup trucks almost unrecognizable. I'd seen buses with, big heavy caliber machine gun bullet holes all the way down the side and burnt out. And you think you're going to go into some sort of post-apocalyptic Mad Max style war zone, and it just wasn't the case. As I said, there was some damage towards the outskirts and in some of the smaller villages where there'd been heavy clashes, but the main part of the city was fine. Again, very westernized. That's where I walked around with the GoPro on my chest at night, and there were, should we say, skimpy outfits in some of the shop windows, which I certainly wouldn't have expected in any Muslim country. There were sweets, there was there's falafel, the sights, the smells, the sounds you expect. There were some bars around. It seemed quite peaceful. It seemed nice, and everyone seemed really happy.
That's almost just kind of characteristic of how everything happens in the media. That it happens with elections, it happens with America, it happens with England, and it happens with the Middle East, right? If you look at the media coverage of Syria, right now you'd expect to go somewhere like that, and it looks like somebody just dumped a box of Lego over a desert, right? But they don't.
Very poignant way of describing it.
But obviously, there's much more life there than there is, and the same's true in Iraq as well. That there's thriving centers of civilization still, even despite the destruction.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, I've been, I've done some interesting things. I was a security contractor for almost a decade in various forms and various levels, and I've travelled to some relatively dangerous places, potentially not by comparison for Syria, but this was the first trip where I'd sorted a will out, where I'd actually written a letter to my girlfriend, basically sort of, the saying goodbye, and I'd actually got my affairs in order. I've never felt like that before for a trip. had to get specialist travel insurance, obviously, because I was going into a war zone. It's, you know, categorized as potentially the most dangerous country on earth at the moment. The government website advises against all travel under any circumstance to Syria. We have no diplomatic ties or relations there. We have no embassy anywhere near. You go there and you are on your own. And I have to honestly say, I think it was one of the safest countries I've ever been to. Just a complete misconception from what I thought I was walking into.
I think almost, and I felt that in Israel as well, that you kind of have all this Israel and Palestine as well. You kind of have this conception of everything is crazy, but it is actually almost the craziness just puts everyone on higher alert. So there's more security, there's more attention to these things. So when things flare up, it's chaos. But when things are in normal order, there's almost more alertness to it, which kind of keeps everything safer.
Yeah. I think if you were on holiday in Spain and you saw a main battle tank on the side of the road with the turret blown off, I think it might raise some eyebrows. But I think when you're walking into Syria, driving through, and after what you've seen, it's, you know, it brings it home. But I think it doesn't seem out of the ordinary. It almost seems like, well, yeah, of course there's going to be, you know, a Russian tank destroyed over there in the field. The thing that makes it seem a bit safer is how rusty it was. So at least it sort of gives it that edge that there was some time between when it happened and where we are now.
Well, the thing that makes me think about is looking at these countries is that my grandmother grew up in London. So you go to London 70 years ago, also parts of it are a bombed out ruin.
Yeah.
And it just seems like such a long way away now. But it's this demonstration how you can have this hope and forward progress even after something as awful as the Blitz or the war that's happened in Syria.
Yeah. One of the most beautiful things I saw, and one of the main focuses of my trip, was to show people you could do it. And obviously it's quite a big selling point to go to somewhere like that and to show people, because we do have this sort of obsession with, you know, this dark tourism. But to show people that it was genuinely safe and it was right to travel, but to show the fact that people were rebuilding. And I think this was a huge part that's been missed from the media. And one of the best things that I saw was in Homs, and all around me, you know, there were big, heavy caliber holes in walls from Dushka machine guns, from mortars, from RPGs. There were destroyed buildings. And in all of this chaos, this pain, this misery that you perceive, was a guy on the second floor just rebuilding a brick wall, brick by brick. And I just thought that was one of the best photos that I took of the whole trip, to just show that is literally how simple it is. And it was that blitz mentality that you were talking about, where you have to carry on. There's no alternative. And it was almost like they couldn't comprehend that there was anything else to do other than to rebuild your country, rebuild your future, your home, and everything that you've had brick by brick. Very similar to the line in the the poem by Rudyard Kipling. If
Yeah, share that if you can remember it.
I can't remember it line by line, but essentially, if you can rebuild everything that you've worked for with worn out tools, I will try and pull up the exact verse and find it for you. But that's pretty much it. The picture that I've got of the wall. If you bear with me 1 second. So I put everything onto my SD card just in case they decide to take the phone off of me.
Yeah, good plan.
I was trying to get some photos in some pretty interesting places. So I don't know whether you can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was just, I mean, you can see if you look behind where the guy is on the side of the photo, you can see the bullet damage to the wall behind him. And yeah, he's just it's just rebuilding that brick by brick. And I love that. Yeah, there's a lot of strength in that photo, I think.
So how do this is something we've probably shared. You go out into the world, you see this kind of craziness, and then you go back to Northampton.
Yeah.
How are you handling that transition? How does kind of real life feel after experiencing real life?
I think there's a certain level of guilt. I went home and I didn't have to worry about anything. I think the only real fear that I had the day that I came back was making sure that I had a shirt ready for work the next morning. I didn't have to worry about the journey. I didn't have to worry about where my family were. I didn't have to worry about food, water, electricity, anything at all. And I think there's a certain level of guilt that you hold on to after having been to somewhere like that. It was the same when I returned from North Africa after I sat and watched kids in a place that looked rougher than Homs did, going through wheelie bins and pulling out plastic bottles to go and try and sell them for the recycling. And I was sat in a 2014 Ford Cougar with the air conditioning on because I was too hot. And I just sat and watched that, and I think that's something that I took with me. The same going through some of the really, really poor areas of South Africa when I was there in May. I think it doesn't matter where you go like that, it makes you feel incredibly fortunate to be where you are, but you still retain a little bit of guilt, I think, from each trip, which I suppose is the humbling side of it.
So what do you then do with that, right? Because you kind of have these shaking experiences of like, this kid may not find a shirt, and I have got to figure out which shirt to wear. What do you then do with that? Like, what's the direction you kind of channel that in?
I think that's something that I'm trying to find myself with at the moment. I think obviously myself and my partner, we started the Adventure Life as a company, as a brand, purely with the focus of using it to help other people travel to these places, and obviously in turn, tourism brings more wealth into the country. So that was something that we were hoping for, and that's why we try and travel to these different places. I think I've now made it a personal mission with Syria. I've never felt this way before, and I think having seen the people there with these economic sanctions imposed on them, I think I've sort of taken it as a personal mission now to do everything I can to try and increase tourism back to Syria, because you can't send any money into the country. You can't send anything through Western Union or MoneyGram or anything like that. The only way to do it is to take physical cash into the country. And the only way that you're going to see that happen now is through increased tourism. And I think it's a big agenda of mine now to really highlight to people how easy it is to travel there, how safe it is, how to do it, give them all of the necessary information, the contacts, locations, and advice on how to do that. And to really share the truth about the way things are, and to show how contradictory it is to what we've been told through Western media. So I think that's probably my way of dealing with the guilt, potentially, but also my way of giving back to the people there.
So it seems like right now that the sanctions that are in place against Assad seem to be under the premise of, well, he's hurting his own people. When it seems like that regime seems to be the stablest thing the people have right now.
Yeah.
So there seems to be sounds like there's now some basis of stability in the country. So I guess the question people have to answer is, if you get back to a place of stability again, how do you get away from those roots that led to the collapse of everything in the first place?
Difficult one. I think the biggest problem you've got at the moment is that the only people that are suffering in Syria through these sanctions are the everyday people. Assad's doing fine. He has a palace.
Right.
The sanctions are hurting the everyday people in there. They simple things like cars. You can't get new cars there. There's no money coming in. Because of that, there's a massive lack of tourism. It's just killed the economy. So yeah, it does have a knock-on effect for those at the top. But really, the same as anything, the only people that will suffer are the people right at the bottom. I think ultimately, if you look at the way this started with the uprising from the rebels before they were infiltrated by al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, really wasn't anything to do with the West. I mean, if anything, we should be offering anything we could because of the destabilization that we caused in the Middle East in the first place with, what was an illegal war in Iraq. I think all of the deaths in the Middle East, I mean, we've got blood on our hands over that. And I think the government sort of played this proxy war thinking, well, that Assad would be out by Christmas and we, same as we did in Iraq or like we tried to do in Libya, we would have somebody in that would be, would side with the West over it. And we got it wrong. We got it wrong big time on this. And Russia has kindly stepped in to sweep up the pieces. And I think ISIS in particular were only allowed to grow to the size that they were because we stood back and we did absolutely nothing. Obama, I think, was too scared to step in and use the force that I think they should have done. Exactly the same with the UK as well. I think because of that, you had the Hezbollah fighters come in from Lebanon and in from Iran that were instrumental in pushing ISIS back and regaining a lot of ground that they'd taken, including saving Damascus. The Russians then came in and sort of finished the job and did a lot of the things that we were potentially too scared to do. Obviously, having just spent 15 years in wars in the Middle East that the British and the American public don't have the stomach for anymore. And I think now we're going to be left by the sidelines out there. And I think that's what we're seeing sort of culminating with Iran and Iraq at the moment, which is in the news. I think we offered too little too late, having caused it all.
Yeah, the way I kind of see it is, if you imagine the American government is like a married man who has a child with another woman, right? And that other woman is and that child becomes modern Middle Eastern society. Now, we 100% should not have fathered that child. We had no place doing that.
Yeah.
However, since we've done it, we now have to be supportive. We have to do something. And then the society is like the people. The government is like the mother. And then Iran is like the shady, abusive boyfriend who's trying to seduce the mother. So it's like there's a real threat there, and we started a war we should not have started, and then we left without cleaning up the mess, without properly finishing what we started, and now people are coming in to fill in the vacuum that we left.
Yeah, we had a massive responsibility there to really try and bring peace and stabilisation to the Middle East after we caused the huge problems out there, and we didn't do that. I think then we saw this problem flaring up in Syria, and again, rather than offering somebody like Assad the support that I think would have helped with military intervention, I know we were on the ground as almost in a consultancy role, which I think was probably the best step, but with more airstrikes, with more use of drones, with more use of the technology, we could have finished ISIS relatively quickly before it managed to expand out the way that it did. And it's now in Afghanistan. We saw the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria, areas like that, and well aware of the atrocities they've carried out there. We've sort of just stood back and let this flare up. And it's only now that, I mean, Iran has wanted Iraq since the downfall of Saddam, and the people weren't interested. And I think that you know, the West has just really screwed things up now to the point that Iran certainly seems like one of the better options for them.
Well,
you know, they are Islamic. They share some of the similar principles. I think they're so done with having the West in there now that I think they're going to walk in.
it depends. I think that there's some factions of the Shia community that want that, but the more Iraqis I talk to, and I just did another episode with a guy who is an Iraqi security officer, and I think they actually want more U.S. bases. They want Iran out, and they're generally very happy about the assassination of Soleimani.
Right. So again, just Western media skewing things, is it?
Yeah. So I mean, for sure, there is a complex country. There are for sure people who want to be part of Iran, but if you look at the protest movements there right now, most of what those people are protesting is the perception that their government is an Iranian puppet and isn't doing anything for the people. So generally, they're kind of taking the attitude of, yes, America, you are our deadbeat dad, but we need your help right now. So I think they're not, it's not that they have this idealistic vision of being part of America, but I think that they would rather, I think basically what they see is America trying to get out of the situation and Iran trying to get into the situation. And it's, you probably want the help of the person that's trying to leave you alone rather than the person who's trying to take over everything.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I suppose my only real interaction with the situation has been what I've seen over the past few days on Western media. Because obviously this all happened after I got back from Syria, where I'm sure they've probably got a very different perception. One thing I did find interesting was when I was out there, is I actually bumped, so I didn't see any other Western tourists the whole time I was there, apart from a New Zealand girl and a guy that lives in Wales who was actually from Leighton Buzzard, originally just down the road from me, who were both teachers in Iraq. And I said, you know, what's it like living in Iraq at the moment? Thinking about what's happened post-ISIS and how are things stable. And they just said, you know, the protests are getting really bad. I'd heard nothing about them. Didn't know anything about the protests. No, I'm not saying they weren't on the media at all, but it certainly wasn't the centre stage that it's had in the past sort of 4 or 5 days here. And I just, you know, I sort of talked to them. They said, yeah, I think the reality on the ground is a lot different from the way the Iraqi media is letting on. And in actual fact, there's probably at least twice as many people that have gone missing than are being reported. And they said things are getting really out of hand there and it's getting really bad. As I said, I didn't know anything about it. Obviously, cue the drone strike from the Americans on the Iranian general, and that all became centre stage. This is the first, really, that I think myself and a lot of people had heard about it. So I think our perspective was quite skewed over here from what the reality would be over there.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the conversation changes once you talk to people on the ground. And it's amazing to me how many people are making decisions, big decisions, without really having any idea about it. Because people make decisions based on what's politically expedient here, rather than for the good of the people over there. There's just almost no connection.
And I'll be honest, I mean, I'm a traveller and I'm an explorer. I'm not a politician. I'm not a historian. And I think this is the first time that I've travelled somewhere and the trip has had a political motivation of some kind. Now, it certainly wasn't the main focus of what I'd done at all. The main focus of what I'd done was travelling to a place that people think you can't go to and showing them you can and how to do it. I think once I was there and I started to see the political implications of what was happening and how the people were still suffering, but you know, my thought about the people suffering there would have been the war. Was, you know, the tangible things, the gunfire, the explosions, the rockets, all the things you expect to see, when in actual fact it wasn't. It was the political sanctions being put on them. So it's interesting to now really start looking into what's happening out there and how it's all so interconnected. with what's happening with Russia, with what's happening with Iran. And I just feel, again, really sad that just when you think Syria is going to find peace out there, and Iraq and Syria are going to become really stable, the economy can start to grow. We can, just the day-to-day sort of livelihoods of the people can start to improve, and then yet again we're hit with another big issue. People are saying that World War III is looming around the corner, which I don't think is the case, but it's certainly causing more issues. And again, the only people that I think are going to suffer day to day are the everyday people there.
Right.
So yeah, I think this is something that I'm going to be watching quite closely now, and trying to learn as much about it as I can, to just try and be a bit more informed.
Yeah, for me, I'm kind of in the same boat that I'm not overly interested in politics and how but because basically it all comes from religious motivations for me, that ultimately I want to see the kingdom of God flourish on earth, and I want to see people live in peace and prosperity and flourishing. And there's so many ways politics gets in the way of that.
Yeah.
And I think more and more what I see is men's egos getting in the way of people's ability to flourish. So my politics really becomes about getting people out of the way, getting politics out of the way as much as possible, so that people's potential to thrive can be unleashed.
Whereas, how do you feel about Trump's new religious advisor?
Oh gosh.
We've had some interesting reports about her over in the UK.
Is that Paula White?
I think that's the last. Is there a place for religion and politics to go hand in hand to that extremity, do you think? I mean, you gave the example earlier about Saudi being almost two separate entities that have an understanding, and from that they have this symbiotic relationship where they'll just work together, and they keep the two entities separate. Whereas in America, I couldn't ever imagine there being an atheist president. The two seem to be so interconnected there. But do you feel that being a politician almost retracts away from your religious ideologies, or your ability to really conform to those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the way I'd answer this is, if you look at the Bible, there are very distinct offices of government in the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So in the Old Testament, the way God sets up a society is there's yourself, which is the main form of government, that you are responsible for you. That's the first thing, right? And then you have family government, that fathers are responsible for the well-being of their wives and their children and the people that live with them. And then you have the priests, right? And what the priests do, the priestly system in the Old Testament, this isn't the New Testament, they represent the temple. They represent these animal sacrifices, which are there for when people breach good morals and God's law. Then they acknowledge that, they go to the priests and receive this kind of cleansing ritual, right? They're there to be kind of moral advisors. And then you have the king, who is responsible for civil law, like punishing murder, punishing rape, protecting the country from invasion, punishing theft, these sorts of things. You're the king in the courts. And it's actually really important that those things have separate roles. So often what happens in the Islamic world is that you have all those things rolled into one. Religion, government, family, society all end up being this one giant web that you can't really separate from each other. So it's very difficult for the sides to speak to each other. Right now, so on the other hand, I don't think it's possible to separate church and state completely in the way people in secular England would talk about it, because ultimately, you could say, well, do you believe in the separation of morality and state? And we're like, no, of course not. But the thing, I'm not saying non-religious people are immoral. But even non-religious people have a worldview, right, which decides this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. And they want the laws to reflect their internal sense of morality, right? That's so the mistake people make is they think, well, I'm secular, I don't have a religion, therefore I'm neutral, I just have common sense. When everybody has a worldview and everybody wants to see their worldview put in politics. Now, as a Christian, I want the church and the state to have very distinctive jobs, but I want the state to do what is right. I want it to be honest. I want it to protect people. I want it to defend against foreign enemies, right? I want the state to do all those things. And then the church's job is to proclaim compassion and mercy, to help people, to speak truth to people, to challenge bad ideas, right? So you have exactly, right? So you have these different roles. So I have no problem in theory with a leader of a country having a religious advisor, because every advisor they have has a worldview. Now, that said, with someone like Paula White, who believes in prosperity theology, which is kind of like this Christian version of a pyramid scheme, you're poor because you don't have enough faith. If you send in money into my show, then God will magically make money appear from somewhere if you give me your credit card details, right?
These televangelists. Yeah,
that's awful. There's plenty of Christians who speak up against that as well. There's actually there's a great rap song about by a guy called Trip Lee, called I think it's called "False Teachers." So I'll send it to you.
Write that down.
So I think, but also what you have is this very apocalyptic end times view with a lot of these people as well, that it's kind of meddling in the Middle East is a kind of means to an end. They think support Israel unquestionably. The Middle East is destined to be in this great conflict with Israel. So let's just stoke the fires, make Israel as strong as possible. The war will happen, Jesus will come back, right? That is a poisonous worldview for foreign policy. And it's not the way the Bible would have us approach foreign policy. The Bible talks about, from the beginning, God calls Abraham and he says, I'm going to make you a great nation so that in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So the idea is that the Bible believes in nations, but it's not this insular, Britain first, America first, screw everybody else kind of nationhood. It's your own nation, which is going to be great for the sake of others, right? And the great nation is defined by having just laws, being a land flowing with milk and honey, so economic prosperity, and care for the rest of the world. Those are the markers of a great nation biblically. Then in the Old Testament, you have one nation of Israel, and then you have a prediction about the kingdom of the Messiah. And what the prediction of the Messiah is that the Messiah is going to have a kingdom where it's going to break apart and destroy all the kingdoms of earth, and it's going to bless all the nations of earth. So the vision of the kingdom of Israel in the Bible is not this great empire which takes all political authority, right? It's a heavenly kingdom that spans across all nations, destroying all the dominions of men, but blessing all the nations. So from a biblical perspective, people having self-determination, self-governance, their own space is a good thing. It helps distill power around the world. And the kingdom of God is always growing from heart and heart to mind and mind. It's like, if you know the classic British song, I vow to thee my country. And the second verse, right, there is another country I've heard of long ago. And then it says, and soul by soul and shiningly and silently its shining bounds increase. So the idea is that Jesus' kingdom is slowly spreading over the world, destroying the kingdoms of men, but blessing all the nations, helping people flourish everywhere. And that is the kind of foreign policy that Christians should be working towards. Loving our neighbors, loving other nations, fighting for people's self-determinations for their own future so that everywhere on earth can thrive. And no matter what happens, that is the future we should be working towards. Because we don't know when Jesus is going to come back. And we shouldn't try and control that. We should do what we've been told to do, which is love the world, bless all the nations of the earth, and pray for peace and well-being of people.
I think if everybody had that worldview, the earth would be a much nicer place to live in. But it is interesting to see that there certainly are clearly defined roles set between each, as you were saying. I think from the way that you've explained it, I think, you know, government and religion certainly can go hand in hand. I just don't think that they are.
No, they're not. But the thing is, if you don't have those clearly defined categories, it will always seep back into other things. So if you think about British and American politics right now, you have politics, and I would say the left wing especially, although I also, there's problems on the right as well. The left wing especially wants to focus morality, this kind of woke culture, and government into one single entity. And what is that but the combining of church and state? They don't call it a church, but it's a religious worldview they're trying to make this totalitarian system that fixes everybody's problems. And so if you look at the history of England and America, if you look at the idea of separation of church and state, it's not a secular concept. It's a Protestant Christian concept. So have you ever read a letter concerning toleration by John Locke?
No.
So John Locke is basically considered the father of freedom of speech in the Western world. And if you look at the argument he makes, the argument he makes of why the state should not punish dissenting religious views is not about practical prosperity. It's about the life of Jesus. He's saying, if you look at Jesus' life, Jesus never uses force to try and get someone to agree with him or to suppress those who disagree with him. He actually peacefully, persuasively goes to his death for the sake of truth and then comes back from the dead. So you can't enforce the truth by the sword. You can't, but you also can't kill truth. So in Europe previous to John Locke, you've got the idea that the government is there to help truth prevail. And the argument John Locke is essentially making is the government's job is to create this free and fair arena where truth and error can do battle publicly. And in that setting, the truth will always win eventually. So let's enforce that free and fair arena and let truth win. And that's the basis of freedom of expression in Western society. Comes from biblical roots where you separate these things, you put them in their proper categories, and you trust God for the result, not the government.
Yeah, and I think it's a very logical way of looking at things, and a very realistic way of looking at things as well. I think. I mean, you know yourself. I'm not a religious guy at all, but the thing that I liked about you so much was how you provided very relevant and understandable reasonings as to how religion was so integrated into every part of our society, and how easy it was to follow that. And it wasn't just a book of far-fetched stories, which is how a lot of people I think perceive it, because they don't have the knowledge and they've not read the Bible. They don't understand it to these lengths, and how there is this sort of this link within, from state religion, within politics, within every day part of our society. That's why I really appreciate the way that you explain things like that.
And that's the thing with the Bible, right? So all the far-fetched stories I 100% believe, but what you're going to find in the Bible that's the most miraculous thing is not so much the stories about the Red Sea opening. We know we live in a world where weird things happen sometimes. What you're going to find that's most miraculous is its ability to deal with human nature. And it's this sort of
Yeah.
unflinching look at what humankind is, and it provides some of the solutions for those things, but not all of them. It's not a list of rules that gives us this, okay, if you do this, 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 and this, and this, everything will work. It's your central problem is you're disconnected from the creator of everything good in you, and you have this good and evil nature warring in you, and to be reconciled to God, you need the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's kind of the ground zero for everything. And there's principles to live by, like loving God and loving your neighbor. But those things aren't handed to you on a silver platter, being like, okay, do this, 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 not this, not this, not this, this. It's a game of principles where then you have to figure out how to apply them. It's not just an easy answer for everything. It's a set of foundations to then build answers in a difficult reality like the one we live in. So
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a pitch for you.
Yes.
At some point in the next 5 years, you and I should pick a destination like Israel or somewhere else in the Middle East and do a tour of it and record a bunch of philosophical religious conversations.
From the perspective of the pastor and the atheist.
Yeah.
I think I would learn a lot from that. I think I would. And you know, and this is the thing, so I'm not religious at all, as I said, and you know, but I don't scoff at any of it, and I find it so incredibly interesting, and I learn a lot from you as well. I think, you know, the various conversations we've had, as I said, a lot of it from the atheist, I think it's just from people that don't really know, is the lack of understanding, the lack of knowledge on the subject. As I said, I think that's why I find it so easy talking to you, because of how well you explain these things. And you challenge a lot of misconceptions as well that people like myself initially have. So yeah, that would be really interesting.
Well, and I think the thing to remember is that there are plenty of people who profess to be Christians and genuine Christians who don't have depth to this. They haven't grown up in a place where they've been encouraged to have any depth. And that's a huge problem in Christianity right now, in the Christian world, is people without a thorough understanding of the foundations. But also that's true, I'd say, in secular society as well. You've got lots of people who don't really know why they're a Christian. And the same, you've got a lot of people who don't really know why they're an atheist or an agnostic, or why they believe what they believe at all. And I think it's important for all of us to ask bigger questions, to figure out, why do I actually believe what I believe? And talking to people who we disagree with is a really important step in that, because if we just dismiss people we disagree with, then more than anything, it just shows an insecurity about what we believe. And if we're confident in what we believe, then there's no threat to us to be able to talk to people who think different things from us. It's an enriching experience, helps us remember why we believe what we believe. It might change some things. It helps us learn. So it's an important conversation.
Yeah, I feel the same way about religion as I do about politics. I know enough to know that I don't know anything. So.
Well, thank you, man, for being on the show. I will link to all your stuff that you want people to find in the description for the video. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for being on the show, and thanks you guys for listening to the Almeida Initiative podcast. We will be back next week with another episode.